In the past couple of years, our ministry at Holy Trinity to persons in the community who have been variously labeled as immigrants or refugees has increased. As that ministry has increased, so have the questions that have come from our parishioners about how we do that ministry and who are we ministering to. The newspaper and the news media are full of concerns about how many immigrants our country takes in and what the effect of the immigrant population is on the various pieces of the infrastructure of our communities. I heard so many times the question, what's the difference between an immigrant and a refugee? And finally, this past summer, began to talk to people in the congregation who deal with that population, Jerry Chapman, Marty Halliburton, and others. As we talked, one thing surfaced strongly. This is not about us and them. There are no people over there that we stand against, because one of the basic tenets of our faith is that we believe that all human beings are God's children. All of us are children of one God. And if that is our belief, then what is our responsibility? I went back and I began to look at two words that come up over and over again in the scripture. The word stranger and the word hospitality. I found that stranger, alien, immigrant, and refugee all essentially have the same meaning. Here are some scriptural examples from Exodus. You shall not oppress a resident alien. You know the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. From Leviticus, when an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And so it continues throughout the Hebrew Scriptures and into the Christian Scriptures, where Jesus says in the 25th chapter of Matthew, "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." And finally, in the letter to the Hebrews, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels unawares. It is clear that from the very roots of our tradition, the issue for us is one of how to extend hospitality. The ancient Mediterranean world that gave rise to our scriptures practiced 5 types of hospitality. There was public hospitality, that which was practiced by states and nations as part of their foreign policy. There was temple hospitality. There was a place to reside, to stay in the temple, and that was to facilitate pilgrimages to holy places. There was commercial hospitality, enabling travelers to receive food and lodging for a fee. There was private hospitality, which, as we'll see in a moment, was very much a part of the Jewish faith and so was seen as a moral virtue. And finally, there was something called theoxenic hospitality, which was the understanding that sometimes human beings entertain or offer hospitality to gods or semi-divine beings. All 5 types of hospitality are found in early Greek, Roman, and Jewish sources, as well as in our very own scriptures. If you study the words and look at the history of hospitality, you see that the early practice of hospitality was about the business of establishing a relationship between 2 individuals previously unknown to each other. The wayfarer in a foreign land in those days was highly vulnerable, and so hospitality was really a magnanimous act on the part of the host. But to abuse or take advantage of the host was just as egregious a violation of the norm as not extending hospitality in the first place. Now, if you are a Homeric scholar, so you've read the Odyssey in the original Greek, there's a bit of a sort of a historical, liturgical side note here. Scholars who have studied and recorded observations of Homer's writings learned that certain rituals were very, very important in that culture. These included the host waiting at the door for the guest, and then an entrance procession, a very stylized greeting between the host and the guest, usually something along the lines of "The Lord be with you and also with you." The centrality of a meal to hospitality, always some form of worship involving a libation or sacrifice, and ultimately a farewell blessing and indeed a procession with the guest and the host at least part of the way toward the guest's next destination. If we remember that Homer wrote some 700 years before the birth of Christ, perhaps it is not too much to think of these hospitality conventions as being part of the formative foundations of our own Sunday worship liturgies. In any event, we can see that the ancient world that gave birth to our scriptures and our faith took the practice of hospitality very, very seriously. When people sat down to eat together, they were considered pledged to each other for at least as long as that person was sustained by the food and the drink of that first meal, which was generally considered to be a period of 3 to 4 days. In the nomadic culture of the Hebrew peoples, if a stranger knocked at the door of the tent, the owner of the tent was constrained by the code of hospitality to invite the stranger in, to give them comfortable accommodations, to provide the very best food and drink available. And this constraint held even if the person knocking at the door of the tent fell into the category of enemy. You see, the practice was more for protection than for generosity, because the host never knew when he himself might be dependent on the kindness of others. Throughout the Mediterranean world, the entertainment of the stranger as guest was and continues to this day to be a sacred duty, more heartily and stringently kept than many a written law. For the Jew, extending private hospitality to strangers was a practice of Torah, the law or way of grace. Offering hospitality in the ancient Jewish tradition was a matter of personal piety, a personal spiritual practice, much as daily centering prayer or walking the labyrinth would be for us. The New Testament, the Christian scriptures, describes Jesus as being dependent upon hospitality for his daily shelter and food. Hospitality was assumed when the disciples were sent forth, and in large measure, it was hospitality that made possible the extensive journeys of the early Christian missionaries such as Paul. Thus it was this tradition of hospitality that allowed the retention of the living voice, the oral tradition of the gospel, and thus preserved it for us in future generations.